The ending of Ursula K. Leguin's sixth Earthsea novel, The Other Wind, the resolution of the three problems or crises that book begins with, and the culmination of the entire Earthsea series takes place through an undoing of one of the central features of that narrative land that we saw from the very beginning with a wizard of Earthsea and then running through the other works as well. And everything kind of gets brought to a closure point, but there's also the possibility of new things still happening. And this has to do with pulling down the wall of stones that separates off, as originally thought, the dry land of the dead from the world of the living. But it turns out that this wall of stones is also a demarcation point for something else. And this emerges in the discussions of the agreement, the division, the verdunand that was made between human beings and dragons, and how it was violated by some of the archipelagan humans who used magic, who used the language of the making to do something. And so there's this discussion that goes on, and here we go. This is a talk that's given by the namer, the master namer. I say what I have half learned, half guessed, not from village tales, but from the most ancient records in the isolate tower. So this is on Roke. 1,000 years before the first kings of Enlad, there were men in Ea and Solea, the first and the greatest of the mages, the rune makers. It was they who learned to write the language of the making. They made the runes which the dragons never learned. They taught us to give each soul its true name, which is its truth itself. And with this power, they granted to those who bear their true name life beyond the body's death. So they did something new. They didn't just take the language that the dragons began with. Actually, all beings, all rational beings, human and dragon alike, who were originally one race, began with. They innovated. They wrote them down. They assigned to individual human beings, or discovered for human beings, their true names. And those true names gave them the possibility of something. Seppel then, the Pelnish wizard, says, life immortal. And so the idea here is life immortal in what sense? In a dreary, deprived existence? No. Life immortal in a beautiful land, a great land of rivers and mountains and beautiful cities where there is no suffering or pain, where the self endures, unchanged, unchanging forever. That is the dream of the ancient lore of Palm. Now, notice what he's saying. It's not just that the land is eternal. Individual beings have this beautiful, painless existence where they can continue on after they have died in the body. Sounds kind of heavenly, doesn't it? Now, in doing so, the ancient mages did something that was not just, you might say, on the side of violation, a direct violation of the division and the agreement that was made between the peoples. And so the summoner says, where is that land? And Irian says, on the other wind, which is our realm, the realm of the dragons. She says, do you think our realm is only a few rocks at the edges of your rich islands? You own the earth, you own the sea. We are the fire of sunlight, we fly the wind. You were not content with your share. You wanted not only your cares, but our freedom. You wanted the wind. And here's where she says something really important. By the spells and wizardries of those oath breakers, you stole half our realm from us, walled it away from life and light, so you could live there forever. Now, was it exactly half? We don't know. It doesn't matter. A significant portion of what was to be the dragons was taken by these mages. And what did they do? They created a wall that living beings, including dragons, could not pass. So the patterner continues the story and says, the ancients saw the dragon's realm was not of the body only, that they could fly outside of time, it may be. Envying that freedom, they followed the dragon's way into the west. Beyond the west, they claimed part of that realm as their own, a timeless realm where the self might be forever, but not in the body as the dragons were. So the dragons exist in this timeless realm, the other wind, in their bodies, because they are magic itself. They are the language of the making. Only in spirit could men be there, he continues. So they made a wall which no living body could cross, neither man nor dragon, for they feared the anger of the dragons. So they set up a kind of defensive bulwark to keep the dragons out. Their arts of naming laid a great net of spells upon all the western lands, so that when the people of the islands die, they would come to the west beyond the west and live there in the spirit forever. So they're taking part of this wonderful existence and claiming it for their own, setting up this wall that will keep the dragons out. You might say creating a funnel that will take the souls or spirits of those who die to there, and then things go wrong. And why? Well, we don't know. There is a proverb here that said, Arian says, greed puts out the sun. These are Kalesine's words. And what does end up happening? As the wall was built and the spell laid, the wind ceased to blow within the wall. The sea withdrew. So these important fundamental elements are not being lost, but are being, you could say, reduced into a different state. There is no wind within the dry land. It is the dry land because there is no sea there anymore. And what else happens? The mountains of sunrise became the mountains of the night, the mountains that are known as pain. Those who died came to a dark land, a dry land. And Lebanon says, I have walked in that land. I do not fear death, but I fear it. And we should remind ourselves of some of the features of the dry land. As we saw in some of the earlier novels, it is not a good place. And the people who exist there exist as names and as shadows, but that's it, not existing in their full self. As we've seen, lovers pass each other by without looking at each other. Parents and children don't pay attention. There are indeed cities, but nothing actually happens within the cities. The dead are just there. And so this now we can see as not just, a problematic aspect of existence, but something that was created by human beings. And the mistake is theirs. So what has to be done in order to fix this? The dry land has to be undone and returned back to what it was. And this is going to require pulling down the wall of stones. It also requires alder to be taken as a sort of guide. And what we find is that while they're there in the imminent grove, Alder actually is on the verge of death. He's talking with the other wizards, and he says, the summoner says, the souls of the dead come reaching now across the wall, yearning back into life. And Alder says, no, it's not life they want. It's death, to be one with the earth again, to rejoin it. They all looked at him, but he hardly knew it. His awareness was half with them, half in the dry land. The grass beneath his feet was green and sunlit, was dead and dim. The leaves of the trees trembled above him, and the low stone wall lay only a little distance from him down the dark wall, the dark hill. Of them all he saw only Tahanu, who could not see her clearly, but he knew her. And he says, they built it, but they cannot unbuild it. Will you help me, Tahanu? And she says, I will, Hara. He's dying. And we find out that the summoner brings him back into life. And, when asked about it, he said, well, I could do it. And then he says, I actually shouldn't have done it. They discuss a little bit more and decide that Alder is going to have to be their guide. Why? So Gamble says, he's no guide patterner, a village mender. And Onyx says, Alder has wisdom, but in his hands, not in his head. He follows his heart. Certainly he doesn't seek to lead us all. Yet he was chosen from among us all. Who chose him? Sepple asked softly. And the patterner says, the dead. The dead have chosen him. That's why he's having these dreams. And so what is Alder going to do? We find that he tells Tahanu, she asks him, what do we have to do, Hara? And he says, we have to mend the world. He smiled because his heart had grown light at last. We have to break the wall. And Tahanu says, can they help us? She's gesturing at the dead. And he says, no, but maybe others can. And so he and Tahanu first start pulling away at the rocks. And then the others follow him. And they arrive by different paths. We find that the patterner says, now it changes, and he walked away from them into the darkness under the trees. The summoner, the doorkeeper, and Sepple rose and followed him, quick and silent. Gamble and Onyx followed more slowly after them. So all the wizards are going off to help out with the wall. Lebanon stood up. He took a few steps after the others, hesitated, and hurried across the glade to the low house of stone and sod. And here he talks to the dragon. Irian, will you take me with you? And she says, come then, come quick. And took his hand. Her hand burned like a coal of fire as she lifted him into the other wind. So they're taking two different paths to get there. The wizards are following Alder. Irian is taking Lebanon with her on the other wind because the other wind goes to the stone wall as well. And while they're there, they're all taking part in pulling the stone wall apart. We get descriptions of this. Alder could scarcely move the great stone his hands were on, but the summoner was beside him, stooping with his shoulder against it, and said, now. Together they pushed it till it overbalanced and dropped down with that same heavy final thump on the far side of the wall. Tahanu was wrenching at the stones. Alder saw his own hands cast shadows for an instant from a red gleam. Orm Irian, as he had seen her first, a great dragon shape, had let out her fiery breath as she struggled to move a boulder from the lowest rank of stones deep set in the earth. Her talons struck sparks and her thorn back arched and the rock rolled ponderously free, breaching the wall entirely in that place. So they're all using all that they have, the entire company, Dragon, Archipelagon, and Karg, because, of course, the patterner is a Karg. And they bring down the wall of stones together. What is the result of this? Well, we read, there was a vast, soft cry among the shadows on the other side, like the sound of a sea on a hollow shore. Their darkness surged up against the wall, but Alder looked up and saw it was no longer dark. The dry land is now being restored. Light moved in that sky where the stars had never moved, quick sparks of fire far in the dark west. Then we hear Tahanu saying, Kalesine. He looked at her. She was gazing upward westward. She had no eye for earth. We'll come back to her in a moment. From among the hosts of the dead, a few here and there, like Tahanu, rose up flickering into dragons and mounted on the wind. So the human dead, some of them become dragons. They have the original unity restored. Most came forward afoot. They were not pressing, not crying out now, but walking with unhurried certainty toward the fallen places in the wall. Great multitudes of men and women who, as they came to the broken wall, did not hesitate, but stepped across it and were gone. A wisp of dust, a breath that shone an instant in the ever-brightening light. They are returning back to the earth. And perhaps they will be reincarnated like the Kargs are. Perhaps they will just simply regain their place. What we find is that Alder sees his wife again and is rejoined with her. Lily, he said, she saw him and smiled and held out her hand to him. He took her hand and they crossed together into the sunlight. Do they turn to dust? We don't know. Leguin doesn't tell us. Now we should talk about Tahanu. And this really brings together a number of different themes. We should also remember, too, that Orm-Irian is going to fly off onto the other wind, but the patterner who has fallen in love with her hopes that she will come back to him someday. But what we find with Tahanu, the maimed, abused child who has been raised as a foster by the couple of Tahanu and Ged, Tahanu becoming her mother first, Ged becoming her father later, is that she becomes the dragon that she is. She reached up her arms. Fire ran along her hands, her arms, into her hair, into her face and body, flamed up into great wings above her head, and lifted her into the air, a creature all fire, blazing, beautiful. She cried out aloud, a clear, wordless cry. She flew high, headlong, fast up into the sky, where the light was growing and a white wind had erased the unmeaning stars. And what we find is that this isn't the very last of her. The patterner tells Tenar in her language, they are both Kargs, "My lady, I saw Tahanu. She flies golden on the other wind." And then we have a very touching moment, one that is expressed in a single set of words, but is very deep. Tenar glanced up at him. His face was white and worn, but there was a shadow of glory in his eyes. She struggled, and then said, speaking roughly and almost inaudibly, just one word, "Whole?" He nodded. She stroked Alder's hand, the mender's hand, fine, skillful. Tears came into her eyes. Is she crying for the loss of Alder? Is she crying for the loss of Tahanu? Or is she crying out of a sort of joy? Whole, that word. Tahanu was starved, beaten, raped, abused in so many ways by her parents and the people they traveled with, thrown living into a fire where her body was damaged, destroying one half of her face and one of her hands. And she faced all of the opprobrium that goes along with that in a, you could say, unenlightened society. Over and over again in the book Tahanu, these people try to get at her again until finally they're taken out of the picture through the king's justice and Ged's intervention as well. And so she has lived a tough life. She's able to be whole again. Whole as she never truly was. Whole as a grown adult. Whole as the dragon that she is as well. And this is something that you could say any good parent wants for their children, especially if the children have encountered trauma, setbacks, hurts, damage, to be restored to wholeness. And this is the way that it can happen for Tahanu, to be a dragon. We find at the very end of this, Tenar has returned to Gaunt and is meeting up with Ged, her husband, and she tells him the story of things. And then there's a point where he says, "And Tahanu," a silence. "She went out of the house. When I came out, she was gone. Osver saw her in the sunrise on the other wind." And afterwards, Ged says, "Look there, Tenar." She looked where he was looking into the dim gulf of air above the western sea. "If she comes, she'll come from there," he said. "And if she doesn't come, she is there." She nodded. "I know." Her eyes were full of tears. Lebanon sang me a song on the ship when we were going back to Havnor. She could not sing. She whispered the words, "O my joy, be free." And again, this is emblematic of what it is that a good parent wants for their children, to be free. And that may mean being somewhere else, not having contact, but knowing that their existence is a good one, a better one that is suited to them. The good parent can feel joy in that while feeling sorrow. And this is where the book ends and where the tales of Earthsea come to a close.